Welcome back to the Afinida Insurance podcast. My name is Savannah Abney, and I am your host for the podcast. I don't know very much about insurance, but Alyssa Wilcox does, and I have her here today. She is one of our incredible insurance experts at Afinida Insurance, and today we're talking about all things commercial auto. So if you have a truck fleet, if you just use a lot of company vehicles, if you do a lot of delivery, any situation where you have a lot of commercial auto, this is going to be very, very helpful for you. So Alyssa, I want to jump right into the first question that we kind of tend to get pretty frequently, and that's, what are the big differences between business owners? What's the understanding between commercial insurance and personal auto policies, and understanding that just because you might drive your personal vehicle for work, those things are still very different. Can we kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So I think in general, if you own a business, just know that your personal insurance will never cover your business, like flat, that's it. There are cases where, like, as a business owner, maybe you're a solopreneur and you use your auto, like, to run errands, to get to client sites. You're using your personal auto for the course of business. You can, yes, that's fine. But just know that if you are ever in an accident, and your business is sued, your personal insurance will never step in and cover that. They'll continue to cover your vehicle because you're the owner of the vehicle, you own the policy, and yeah, if you're in an accident, they'll repair your car. But it's when your business is actually included in, like, a third-party lawsuit, there will not be any coverage. You can add, say you have a business owner's policy. We love those BOPs. You can add hired and non-owned auto, and that will provide business coverage for your business liability for the use of your personal vehicle.
So this is a little bit more specific, but what about people who are like delivery drivers or gig workers or contractors? So, I think about like pizza delivery or Uber Eats or something like that. They are using their personal vehicle. Now, those specific situations are, they're not necessarily with a company. It's like a 1099 situation. But let's say you have some sort of contractor or some sort of employee, maybe even it's a full-time employee, but they are using their personal vehicle for work of the company. How does that kind of shake out? How do they determine if they should put that on the BOP, if they should put that additional coverage, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I would say that if you're a gig worker, you're working, like you're an Uber driver, for example, you absolutely have to have a commercial auto policy. Once you start getting people in the car with you, especially, like, that is really important to make sure that you are properly covered. And I believe some of those gig, working situations have insurance built in, but, like, say you're a restaurant owner and you have an employee who use their personal auto for delivery, I would say that you absolutely need to have that hired and non-owned auto liability coverage. And I would also recommend, like, reviewing the coverage limits with your employee. If they're just running with the state minimums of like 15,000, 30,000, it's not a lot of coverage. So you could have extra exposure there. So yeah, I would say that if your job and your business requires delivery, and employees delivering, you're definitely going to want to you're going to need commercial auto insurance.
Some of that, it sounds like, is like just conversation and education with the employee themselves as well. Like you mentioned, if making sure, if I have a delivery driver or somebody like that, like, we need to talk about your personal insurance policy currently, and we need to, like, talk about how to help you get a better one if it's not something that's going to be more comprehensive.
Right. And, like, just because we're covered from a liability standpoint, your vehicle is still covered under the personal auto. So know that that employee is kind of taking on a little bit of that exposure, that risk, by doing the driving.
Can there be a situation, or I guess, how does it typically work from, like, a legal situation where, like, if they didn't have a decent auto policy, it was very, like, state minimums, whatever, and they end up getting injured in an accident, could there be liability on the employer for some of those expenses because they were driving during, like, a work situation?
Sure. So employees, when they are injured in the course of work, whether it's be, driving to make a delivery or in the office or wherever it is, the employee's injuries are always covered under workers' comp. So that is good. At least the employee is covered. It's more about the third-party damages that you have to worry about.
This is sort of, we were already kind of answering this question that I had. What common coverage gaps do businesses often overlook when they get auto insurance? It sounds like we kind of started to talk about that, but are there any other ones that you see pretty often where it's like there's a pretty big gap here you're not thinking about?
I think the hired and non-owned auto is the biggest one. It's, if you have a fleet of vehicles and you're specifically insuring those vehicles, the ones that you own, that's pretty straightforward. So I think that hired and non-owned auto is the biggest gap. Other instances could be just like there are different ways to schedule the vehicles that you do own. So the broadest coverage would be any auto. So if that is an option, that is one way that you can ensure that it's super extensive and will cover you to the best that policy will.
Yeah, I think it's the crossover between personal vehicle use and work that's the most complicated, but also that is grown more than probably it ever has for a lot of different reasons, especially with like remote workers and just the way that the environment has changed a lot. That is like a really, really important piece to focus on, I think, for business owners.
Yeah, I agree. And like, even if you think like, oh, I just drive like every, a little bit to client sites. I mean, if you accidentally smash into the front of your client's building, they might have some concerns and they're going to want to recap that loss.
Kind of switching gears a little bit to cost, what are some cost saving strategies business owners can use to lower commercial auto premiums without sacrificing the essential coverage? So I guess what's the balancing act between the premium and the coverage in this situation?
Yeah, it's really hard, to be honest. Here in California, especially, commercial auto is just one of those things that a lot of carriers, autos and property, like they don't want the risk associated with it. So unfortunately, we're just seeing rates increase across the board on that front. There are ways you can lower your costs. Some clients prefer to look at maybe lower liability limits. As an agent, I always recommend $1 million limits for my commercial clients. You could go, down to $500,000, $300,000, depending on the, type of driving exposures that you have. There's always the option to increase your deductible, so rather than a 500 or 1,000, you can go up to 2,500, 5,000. But really, these are small offsets. So oftentimes it doesn't make a ton of sense to, take on a higher deductible if you're only saving, $50 or something like that a year. So, you can play around with it. But I think that it's just costs are on the rise, and that's where it's important to make sure that you have good drivers. If you have driver standards, that you have employees have to meet, like not having accidents or previous violations, that helps. And then if you do have a fleet, having like a maintenance program in place, those are some ways that you can help to lower your costs.
Got it. Last question for you, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit already, specific to California, but how do state regulations impact the types and levels of coverage that you need to have for commercial auto?
Yeah, the state minimums are very small. I think for California, it's 30,000 per accident or injury, 60,000 max. I mean, if you are in a bad car accident, it's so easy that medical bills would go above 30,000 real quickly. So those minimums, I think, are a little out of date, maybe out of touch with sort of the current reality that we live in. So always good. Like I said, I for commercial, I like to start at $1 million, I would say 300,000 would be the minimum that I would have in place for a liability limits. And for personal, for those who are looking at their own personal auto insurance, like if you have less than 100,000 per accident, 300,000 per, policy, I think that would be a good minimum to start with.
Yeah. And understanding too that those minimums, like you said, they're kind of out of date. They were based on a different economy, a different level of inflation. And people, when those were built, we might not have been quite as litigious as we are now. And in general, just understand that people will kind of sue you for anything. So just making sure you're fully protected, I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And what I find too is that the costs for auto insurance, oftentimes the big bulk of the cost is actually protecting your vehicle. So like, your collision and your comprehensive coverage. The liability is a smaller piece, so it's not that expensive to increase the limits. And so it's definitely worth reviewing.
Well, thank you so much for your expert opinions and advice as always. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Afinida Insurance podcast. Please subscribe to this channel and like this video if it was helpful for you, and we'll see you next month.